As 2025 draws to a close, I think it's time to wrap up the 36 books that I read this year and chat a little bit about them. I'm going to use this tier list to sort of rank the ones that I read, give an idea of what my favorites were, which ones I didn't love so much, and get an idea of what you should read next. So, the way that I'm going to break this down, at the very bottom of the tier list, you will see that there's a nonfiction section. I did read a number of nonfiction books in that 36, and since nonfiction and fiction are just so difficult to rank side by side, I decided to pull those out of the tier list, put them on their own tier, and just allow those to be there. So if you were interested in those, you can just take a look at them there. The rest of the tier list will just be devoted to the fiction books that I read this year, which was the bulk of what I ended up reading. And so I broke this into 5 tiers. The bottom tier is nope. These were books that I straight up did not like. These are books I wouldn't recommend to anyone. They didn't do it for me personally. And thankfully, this year there was only a couple of books that fell into that category. But we'll talk through what didn't really work for me with those, and then what to do with them. Moving up from there, there's decent. These are books that were fine. They were okay. I was excited to get through them and move on to something else, but they didn't make me want to throw them across the room. If these books that are in the decent category fall within a longer series that has books higher up the tier list, I would still probably recommend the series as a whole, get through those decent books and get to the better ones. Moving up from there is good. These are just solid books, books that I enjoyed reading. I would recommend to somebody, particularly if they're in a series with other good or amazing books. I would highly recommend these to anyone. Next up from there is amazing. These are absolute class books. These are top books. I would absolutely recommend these to someone. If they're in a series, I would recommend that they read the series to get to those books. These are some of the best ones that I read this year. And then that just leaves the top 3. These are the top 3, the best books that I've read this year. Books that I will probably think about for a very long time, for years to come. These are books that I would buy for someone just so that they would be forced to read it. They're that good. So, we're going to start at the bottom and we're going to work our way up to the top, and we'll just see what I thought about the books I read this year. So, starting with the nope tier. Let's just get these out of the way. Like I said, there's only a couple that fell into this category, thankfully. But unfortunately, the worst book that I read this year, the one that I rated the lowest, has to be Scythe by Neal Shusterman. And I'm bummed about this because when I first heard about Scythe, I was actually very excited. The premise is super interesting. This world beyond ours that has conquered death. People no longer die. If you do die, you can just be brought back. There's no way that you can die. And so with that, this utopia, there's also this layer where there's still population expanding. And so they have to cull the population back using this organization called Scythes. So that concept really intrigued me. And I did know going in that it was a YA book, so I knew that it was going to maybe be a little bit of a lower level of world building and just sort of like designed for someone younger than me. But what I didn't expect was just how far drawn back that interesting concept and that philosophical concept dealing with morality and who deserves to live and die would really be stripped back and kind of bogged down by a very, very, very shallow world building and very shallow dive into that concept. And so for me, Scythe just did not do that concept justice. I think it's a little bit too heady to do in YA. And by the time I finished the book, I was not interested at all in reading anymore. It felt like it was just a drag to get through. And it didn't really dive into those big concepts the way I hoped that it would. The only other book that I'm going to put in the nope category that I read this year, and it was hard for me to put it here, I almost put it at the end of decent just because the rest of the series I did enjoy a lot, is Ruin by John Gwynne. I really enjoyed the first 2 books in the series, and I'll talk about those as we get to them later. But Ruin, funny enough, it ruined the series for me. It felt like the 3rd book that shouldn't have been. It's a 4-book series. The first 2 books are incredible, and then this one came along, and from what I understand, John Gwynne ultimately split the final book of what was supposed to be a trilogy into book 3 and 4. And in my opinion, it should have remained a trilogy because this 3rd book did nothing to improve the plot. It felt like we were spinning our wheels. It felt like we were just reiterating the same concept over and over and over, to the point where after several hundred pages of reading this, I felt like I was walking in a circle. Characters were making decisions that were completely out of whack with what they had been doing for the remainder of the story, and I just was so incredibly frustrated by this book, particularly off the back of an incredible book in book 2 in this series. So this is one of those ones where I enjoyed the series as a whole. The concept of the story, the first several books were good, but this one was almost enough that it's hard for me to recommend the series. So those are my two big nopes for the year, ones that were really huge bummers for me. But let's move up decent. These are books that, like I said, they're all right. I enjoyed them for the most part. I'd probably recommend them. And so for me, the next book is another John Gwynne, and that is A Time of Blood. This is the sequel series to the previous one. For me, this one was probably slightly worse than the first one. It's just a smaller scale, a little bit of a smaller story. It felt a little bit more repetitive. But overall, it was still a good story. John Gwynne is still a great author. He does some things, particularly battle, combat, soldier organization, those kinds of things he does very, very well, probably better than most that I've read. And so I do like John Gwynne as a whole. This series maybe didn't do it for me. And so, yeah, that's where this book lands. Next in the decent category is the first Brandon Sanderson book. I read a lot of Sanderson this year, but for me, Shadows of Self was probably the worst Sanderson book that I read all year. I just did not connect with this, particularly after how incredible the first trilogy of Mistborn was. Coming into Wax and Wane, I knew that it was probably going to be a little bit of a step down, but I was hoping that it might hit the same levels that I felt in The Well of Ascension as a book too. But Shadows of Self just did not do that for me. The big ultimate payoff at the end of the story, I felt almost no connection to because of the way that the characters were developed from the first book to the second. And so Shadows of Self just didn't land for me, which is unfortunate. But the rest of the series redeemed a little bit more. So Shadows of Self is a decent book. The next book in the decent category is going to be Nettle and Bone. This was an interesting one. This is a book I just picked up on an absolute whim. I picked it up at a bookstore. We were in Victoria, Canada on vacation. I decided I want to just grab a quick book to read on the plane and knock this out in about 3 days. Super quick read, a fun fairy tale, sort of a retelling. It was not really my style of book, but it was a cute story. I thought it did some interesting things. It's a good standalone one, so if you're looking for just a quick knock one out in a plane ride, kind of a fun story, Nettle and Bone, not a bad choice. Wasn't exactly my speed, but a solid book nonetheless. The next book in the decent category, I'm going to put Carl's Doomsday Scenario by Matt Dinniman. So this is the second book in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, and for those of you who don't know, it's a lit RPG. It's a very interesting concept. It kind of came out in that when that explosion of lit RPGs was happening. And this is certainly interesting. But for me, after I'd read Dungeon Crawler Carl, and then I read this, I was like, okay, I get it. I understand what I'm reading. It's a lit RPG. I'm kind of done. And so, while it was good for the lit RPG genre, you have to be very specifically interested in that type of genre in order to continue. For me, I think I'm probably calling it here on the Dungeon Crawler Carl series. I may revisit it eventually. I've heard it does continue to get better and maybe a little bit deeper, but for me, I think I'm going to call it at Carl's Doomsday Scenario. The next book up for me is going to be A Time of Dread. So this is book 1 in the second John Gwynne series. And again, like I said previously, this one was good, not quite hitting the highs of the first series for me. And from what I've understood, it doesn't quite hit the highs of his third trilogy either. This one, it's a smaller story. The characters are good, but it felt like just a continuation and a very derivative of the first trilogy for me. Not much more to say on that. Was decent. If you're a big fan of John Gwynne, read it. Absolutely. I enjoyed like many parts of this book. I enjoyed many of the characters that he wrote in here, and I love that world a lot. from the first series that he wrote, and so it was exciting for me to get back into it. Just not a lot of new offered. The last book in decent for me is The Alloy of Law. This is the first book in Wax and Wayne from Sanderson. The first two books really took a little bit of time to get into, unfortunately. And The Alloy of Law it was so much different. Sanderson originally intended for it to be a standalone novel, and then he just continued to expand it into the 4-book series that it now is today. And it definitely reads like a solo novel. It's a pretty well self-contained story. The characters are decent, but not super well fleshed out, which is, of course, to be expected. In a standalone novel, there's only so much that you can do. And the later books really do extrapolate on those characters a lot more. But it's just a good Western story set in the Cosmere, which isn't exactly my genre of choice typically, but I do like Sanderson. Sanderson does good work kind of wherever he goes. Even his decent books are still very good fantasy stories. And so there are 2 Sanderson books in decent, but the series is good. I would encourage you to read it. Now we move up to the good tier. And these are books that I really enjoyed. These are solid books that I read this year, and thankfully good and above is the majority of the books that I read this year. I think I read a really good mix of books. But we're going to start at the bottom end of good. These are books that are kind of between good and decent, but I thought were enjoyable enough to move up into this tier. The first one of that is going to be Dungeon Crawler Carl. I thought the concept was cool. I love RPGs. I love D&D. I love that kind of like progression fantasy type of story. And so Dungeon Crawler Carl was exciting for me to read. Like I said, once I got to Carl's Doomsday scenario, it started to feel a little repetitive, a little bit samey. I wasn't that invested in the story, but the idea of a lit RPG is pretty cool. I did enjoy reading Dungeon Crawler Carl, and it's a very quick read. It only took me maybe a couple of days to knock that out. So it's a fun, low risk, interesting kind of concept. The next book in good is going to be Wrath. And this is the final book in the first series from John Gwynn's series here. This one was a good ending to the series. However, I did still feel it was tainted by Ruin. Ruin did that much damage to my enjoyment of the series that Wrath to me felt like it was a continuation of Ruin in a lot of ways until the very end. The last, maybe 300, 250 pages of the book were really solid. It wrapped up the character arcs in a satisfying way. It was well crafted in the way that he concluded the book, which really just solidified my feeling that Ruin and Wrath should have just been combined to be a final book in the trilogy. Even if it was a longer book, I think so much of what happened in Ruin and in the first part of Wrath could have just been cut and the story would have been told just as responsibly. So Wrath was much better than Ruin in my opinion. However, it still didn't quite hit the highs that the early part of the series did for me. Next up is going to be The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. This is the final book in the Wax and Wayne series of Mistborn, and I think I enjoyed it. However, I will say that now that I have read much more of the Cosmere than just the Mistborn series, I think that I would enjoy The Lost Metal more now that I've read more. So I do say that it was good. It could even maybe move up higher in the rankings were I to have read it at a later date after I had read perhaps much more of the Cosmere, maybe a lot of the Stormlight Archive. I think that with that kind of basis of knowledge, The Lost Metal probably would have hit a lot better for me. But in my time reading it this year, I felt very lost. I felt like a lot of random stuff was happening that didn't make a lot of sense. And ultimately, I felt like the ending was really predictable. And so I think it was a good book. I thought it was a much better than the first 2 books in the series. And I think, again, it would probably move well up the tier list were I to read it now. Next up is going to be the 3rd book in the Lies of Locke Lamora, the Gentleman Bastards series, and that's The Republic of Thieves. I really enjoyed this trilogy. I, like most readers of the Gentleman Bastard series, is anxiously awaiting the fourth one. Um, but the Republic of Thieves was probably my least favorite of the three. It was an interesting story. It was really self-contained, as much in the way that the other two were, but even more so. I think it was hard for me to pick between the Republic of Thieves and the Lies of Locke Lamora as my least favorite of the two, which is harsh to say because again, it's a good book, and that whole trilogy is excellent. I would highly recommend that trilogy to anyone who likes kind of a heist, a sort of morally gray main character, perhaps even straying into an anti-hero capacity. Um, but The Republic of Thieves was an excellent book. It again just was probably, I think it would be bolstered by a fourth book for sure. I think there's a lot of threads that were intentionally left unsolved that with a fourth book could start to tie up more in a way that didn't happen in the first two. All right, next up is the only short story that I read this year, and that is Mistborn's Secret History by Brandon Sanderson. I really enjoyed Secret History. Again, it was very short, maybe 170 pages, knocked out in a day, maybe two. But I enjoyed it because it built on the first trilogy of Mistborn. There's not a lot more that I can say about Secret History at the risk of spoilers because it is so intrinsically tied to those three books. But for those of you who have read all three and enjoyed them, Secret History is a must read because it really just fleshes out some of the big questions that were remaining and some of the things that were obfuscated purposefully by Sanderson during that first trilogy. All right, next up in good is probably going to be my hottest take or my most controversial take of all the books that I read this year, and that is going to be Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. Words of Radiance is pretty well touted as a favorite Sanderson novel by most of his fans, and I will say I understand why. I think it is very interesting, it's very detailed, very in-depth. I think for me, the level of detail that was examined in this book bordered a little bit on grating for me. And I will admit that it was sort of at a point in my year where I was maybe hitting almost a reading slump. And so a part of me feels or wonders if my rating of Words of Radiance is a little bit skewed or a little bit unfair. But the level of detail in each of the two main characters' stories a little bit started to wear on me. There was so much that I felt happened in there that just was completely filler. I may come back to eat my words as I continue in the series. However, Words of Radiance at the time was enough to kind of burn me out on that level of detail, and so I took a break from the Cosmere after Words of Radiance and moved on, read a bunch of other things, and have now since come back and am diving back into Stormlight Archive, but Words of Radiance just didn't hit for me the same way that I know it has for most other readers, so it may be one that I revisit eventually, but for now, I would say it was a good book, and in the scope of the series, absolutely worth reading. It just isn't a top three book for me like I think it probably would for many Sanderson readers. Next up is another John Gwynne book. I read a lot of John Gwynne this year. He's probably my second most read author after Sanderson, and that is going to be Malice, which is the first book, and I really, really love this book. It was sort of my first dive into that genre of low magic, still high fantasy, very grounded in reality. Hard to call it grimdark, but probably approaching grimdark in a way that I hadn't read in a lot of other series, particularly in Sanderson. And so I really enjoyed Malice. I think the characters were all very interesting. The sort of typical hero's journey that was presented in the way that I just enjoyed. And I think the scale and the scope and the stakes that John Gwynne really proposes here, they made a lot of sense, and they really made me feel attached to the characters and rooting for them. So that is a great start to what I still think is a very good series, despite the kind of major roadblock that it hit later in the series. All right, next up is The Lies of Locke Lamora, the first book in the Gentleman Bastard series. I love this book. It was excellent. I think there's a lot of world building involved in this first book. a lot of, and just the way that Scott Lynch writes, there's a lot of bouncing back and forth in and out of the narrative. And so it was a little bit jarring at first, but as you start to see those threads connect and interlock towards the end of the book, where Locke's past and his present are starting to collide, it starts to make a lot of sense. And so I really enjoy this. I think The Lies of Locke Lamora I would recommend to most people. It's definitely gritty. It's definitely a little bit more of an adult fantasy book, just in terms of primarily the this kind of violence, gang mentality that happens under the surface. But I love the Lies of Locke Lamora. Next up is A Time of Courage by John Gwynne. This is the third book in his second trilogy that follows up. And this is the ending that I wanted Wrath to be. It was a really good closing. And I think this again really solidified to me that the first series should have just been a trilogy, because it cut out a lot of the filler and it just gave us the story the way we wanted it. All of the character arcs ended in a really satisfying way again. It isn't to say happy way, but a satisfying way. And I think it was a really good closing to what has sort of ended up being a 7-book series within the same realm. So I will miss this series. I will miss that world. I really liked the way that he tied the two series together. He didn't, without really leaning too heavily on what came before, but enough sort of tie-ins to really satisfy readers of both. So Time of Courage was excellent. It was a good way to close out that series. All right, next up is The Bands of Mourning by Brandon Sanderson. This is book 3 in Wax and Wane, and it was definitely my favorite. It's the one that still sticks with me. I still think about this book. I think of the way that the magic is revealed to work in different ways than previously expected. I think this is a really big hinge point in the series for me, especially after Shadows of Self, when I was really doubting whether I would end up liking this kind of genre shift from sort of traditional medieval epic high fantasy into more of this industrial revolution western. I think Bands of Mourning kind of brought a lot of that back in, and definitely brought me back in. It was enough for me to really say the series as a whole was good, and I would recommend it to Sanderson fans. I think, again, I would encourage people to read it maybe later than I did. I think reading Stormlight first probably is a better answer than reading this directly after Mistborn Era 1. So again, I think I probably would have enjoyed this series as a whole more with the knowledge that I now have from reading Stormlight. Next up in the good category is Jade War by Fonda Lee. And I did read Jade City in 2024, and so it doesn't appear on this list, but I did read the last 2 books in that trilogy this year, and both of them I thought were amazing. Jade War didn't quite stick with me the same way that Jade Legacy did, but it was a really good middle ground. It brought a lot more scale to the world as this character sort of scattered a little bit more. It gave some more depth to the characters that you really fall in love with, and it starts to just give a little bit more stakes to everything that's happening. It also just kind of had me asking a lot of questions about the characters as far as like, okay, who's good here, who's bad, how far are you willing to go to accomplish your goals. And it did ultimately a great job of setting up Jade Legacy, which I'll talk about later on. And the final book in the good category for me is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I enjoyed the first book of Stormlight. I was still interested in that kind of depth of world building, and still am. But it was early enough in the year that that scale of book wasn't as daunting as by the time that I got through Words of Radiance, it kind of began to feel. I think that there's just so much in Sanderson that is unknown, and that's sort of his MO, is build the deepest world you can ever imagine, but yet have so many questions left at the end of reading all that world building that it's impossible to know what's happening. And The Way of Kings it's a beautiful book. It's truly fantasy storytelling on a scale that few have dared to try. And as I dive deeper into Stormlight in 2026, I'm anticipating that a lot of the questions and things, even from the very first pages of Way of Kings, will start to begin to be answered, which is just Sanderson's bag. He can do that so well. He has an unbelievable vision for his world. And so there's just something incredible about a first book in a series like that. Okay, we're moving up into amazing. These are top tier books I really, really loved, that I would highly recommend to anyone who wants to read them. Books that ultimately can drag other, maybe lesser books in a series up with it, and that where I can recommend an entire series just off of these books being so good. However, the first couple aren't in series at all. And this is something I didn't expect to happen when I started reading Sanderson this year, was that a couple of my favorite books of his would be standalone books. The first is Elantris. Now, Elantris was a big surprise to me. I didn't anticipate Elantris maybe being as enjoyable as it was. It is Sanderson's first book that he ever wrote, or ever published, I shall say. And as a standalone, I didn't anticipate that there would be a level of depth that he has shown in Mistborn, or particularly in Stormlight. But I almost liked it more for that reason, because Sanderson can be wordy. I think no one would disagree with that. Stormlight is 6,000 pages of content to get into that series. Elantris is a much more self-contained book. And I know he's revisiting this world soon, which is exciting because I really connected with the characters. And I think even in the brief amount of time that Sanderson had to give us these characters and to give us this magic system in this world, the story that was told was robust, it was deep, interesting. The characters had a lot of depth to them. And so I really enjoyed Elantris, much more than I expected I would. And I would honestly recommend people who are new to Sanderson perhaps read Elantris first, because it gives a really good introduction to the types of stories that he likes to tell, with strong magic systems, interesting characters, strong villains, and a lot of sort of like contrasting reasonings that the characters are doing what they're doing. Next up is the other Sanderson standalone and the final Sanderson book that I read this year, which is Warbreaker. And Warbreaker was my favorite Sanderson book I read this year. The characters were great. I think that there was enough plot twists involved that I was really invested in the story. The character progression in this book was unbelievable. Every character goes almost 180 degrees. If not 180 degrees, they learn so much depth about themselves that they didn't have at the start of the book, that by the end, you really feel like you've watched these characters mature and evolve throughout the story, and you really root for them. You want to root for all these characters, and I would say that there's a couple of plot twists, particularly, what I would say is the main plot twist of the book that really got me, really surprised me, which isn't always the case in these books. Sometimes you can sort of feel like something's coming, but this book had it for me. I think this is maybe one of Sanderson's best works that I've read so far, which may be controversial seeing that Words of Radiance is so far down on my list, but I really, really loved Warbreaker. The next amazing book that I read this year was The Strength of the Few by James Islington. This, I will say, is probably the most uniquely written book that I read, maybe have ever read. The way that it really flows out of the first book excellently, and it does everything you want it to do. This for me is it's the only series that I read this year that was told from the first person, and this book I think really sold me on how first person perspective can be done amazingly in fantasy writing. I think it didn't. I loved the first book so much. It's hard to pick between the two. I rated them very similarly ultimately, but The Strength of the Few was incredible. It sets up the third book that it's going to feel like forever to wait for, coming in 2027. But The Strength of You is amazing. It's hard to talk a lot about it because talking about it almost spoils the book, but I would highly recommend the Hierarchy series. It's gotten a lot of hype, and I think for very good reason. I would recommend it to anyone who loves science fiction or fantasy because it kind of really scratches both those itches. The next book I'm going to put in the amazing tier is going to be Red Seas Under Red Skies. And that's Scott Lynch's second book in the Gentleman Bastard series, and I think easily my favorite. I truly loved this book. I don't know if it was the more pirate aesthetic that was in this one. I think there was also like very, very good interpersonal relationships and conflict. Both of the main characters had their moments, particularly who would be probably described as the sidekick character. I think really stole the show for me. Jean, I think this is his book. I love him as a character. I loved the relationships he built with the other characters in this. The world building was so cool. I really loved the pirate aesthetic. I loved the island they go to, and just the whole con that they play across the whole book. I think this one was fantastic. I loved this one. It was easily my favorite in the series, and highly, highly recommend. I was sad to see this one end. I was sad for them to move on to the next thing because this one had it all for me. The last book for me in the amazing tier is going to be Valor by John Gwynne. And yeah, this book was incredible. It was so good that it really almost took that third spot in the top three for me. But ultimately, I have it here essentially as my number 4 book, top book that I read this year. And this is book 2 in John Gwynne's Faithful and the Fallen series. And wow, I love this book. The character progression after Malice, the characters that you come to love in Malice, they take huge leaps in development in Valor. And you see them really come into their own. The heroes become the heroes. The villains really become the villains. And this is where I really felt like the story opened up. And so you can imagine my frustration when I then had to read Ruin, and I felt like all of that work that had been done in Valor really just came crashing down. So this is where I get torn on this series as a whole. The Faithful and the Fallen, I would recommend it because Malice and Valor are both excellent books. And Wrath does have a satisfying ending. It's just be aware that the middle section with Ruin and the beginning of Wrath really can pull you out of the story in the way that it did for me. So Valor was enough for me to say that I love John Gwynne as an author, though. I think that he showed in there what he can do with characters. He showed what he can do with his combat writing, which is second to none. And yeah, Valor is an incredible book, almost one of the best books that I've read this year, and enough to justify the disappointment that Ruin was. Which does lead me to the top 3. These are the best 3 books I read this year, books that I'd recommend to anyone, books that justify reading an entire series, and you can see them down there. Those are my big 3. And so coming in at number 3, the third slot for me, is The Will of the Many by James Islington. This book deserves all the hype that it has been getting. The magic system, very interesting. The characters, well written. The only thing I think that dropped this from being my best book of the year maybe was the setting is obviously based strongly in reality. And so I think, especially after reading a lot of fantasy series like Sanderson, where things are so bizarre and unique, The Will of the Many feels very grounded in reality, which is okay. I didn't dislike it. I think it feels grounded in reality in a way that Red Rising feels grounded in reality. Perhaps with a little bit more of a fantasy twist, of course, because Red Rising is based in our world. But The Will of the Many did a lot, and the ending of that book was crazy. And it set up the second book so well. It's so interesting. I haven't read a lot of first-person fantasy, and so to read that, be a little bit unsure about it, and then to really understand why the author wrote it the way he did, it's rewarding. It's rewarding to see that. And so The Will of the Many is an incredible book. Had me on the edge of my seat the whole way. Um, and I really didn't know what was happening until the very, very end of the book. And so there are not a lot of books that can say that. That really keep you interested, but only give you enough just to piece you along until you finally make it to the end. But The Will of Many had that. It did it. I would recommend it to anyone. My number two book of this year was one of the earliest books I read this year, way back in January of 2025, and that is Jade Legacy. Jade Legacy, similar to The Strength of the Few, I think, was written in a pretty unique way over the course of a long period of time within the world. And after reading Jade City and Jade War, and those taking place over progressively longer periods of time, Jade City over just a short amount of time, Jade War over a few years, months, Jade Legacy takes place over decades. And that scale of storytelling, after you've really come to know and love or hate the characters in the story and you want to know what happens to them, Fonda Lee delivers. She lets you know what happened to them. She gives every character in the book that has had an impact an ending. And while some of the characters had endings that I would say are predictable, it didn't make them any less impactful. And that's rare, where you can see the writing on the wall, but it still really gets in you. And there were moments in Jade Legacy where I was feeling heights of or depths of emotion that I haven't felt while reading a lot of books, and I think that's really what solidifies it as a top 3 book for me. Is there was moments in Jade Legacy where I was like truly angry with the characters and with the author how she was treating the characters. And there was moments of real sadness and moments of joy. There's a lot in that book, but it is a really excellent and interesting way to tie a knot on what is ultimately just a story of family and of how far you're willing to go for the ones that you love. And so, highly recommend that. Jade Legacy is the third book in the trilogy, and it is so good. I would encourage anyone to read the other ones. Both Jade City and Jade War are great books in their own respect, but Jade Legacy is worth it just to read. Which, of course, leaves only the number one slot. The best book that I read this year, my number one that will definitely stay with me for some time, and that is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. This book, I mean, similar to Jade Legacy, I think really stuck with me because of the emotions that it pulls out of you. This really was surprised me by the depth of the world building in this. It's not a particularly long book, and it is a standalone book, but the world building is deep. But it also it really touches on a lot of intense topics within that fantasy setting. And man, Emma Wong does not pull her punches. I will say that. This is the only book on the list this year that I read and actually cried while reading. There were impactful moments that heart wrenching and that well written that it actually affected me. And it has everything. It has heartbreak, it has loss and grief, but it also has redemption, and it has family. It has how far are you willing to go to protect the people you love? What does it look like to be a patriot while also standing up for yourself? There's so much in it. It's hard for me to even describe it in just a brief summary as I've been doing with these other books, but it's unbelievable. I think it's under hyped. I think people love this book, but I think too few people have actually read it. And so it's one that I would absolutely recommend to anyone who loves fantasy, anyone who loves very character driven fantasy, and who just loves to read about characters who are strong and who overcome a lot to get where they are. So, Sword of Kaigen rounds out my list as my top book for this year. Those are my 36 books. Obviously, I didn't dive into the nonfiction books. It's a whole separate beast, but all the 36 books are right there. And let me know. What did you guys read this year? What did you love? What should I read next? I already have some ideas. I'm obviously going to be reading a lot more Sanderson next year, diving back into the Cosmere, as well as a whole bunch of other authors that I just need to get around to reading. But if you have some of your top three, what are your top books that you would absolutely shove into my hands if you had the opportunity? I'd love to hear them. But until then, keep reading, and I will see you in 2026.